Our next speaker is Shane Dunn. He earned a bachelor's in zoology from the University of Wyoming and a master's in health administration from the University of Oklahoma. He writes a monthly local history column for the Powder River Examiner in Broadus, which also posts to his website, and you can find that website in speaker bios in your folder. And he specializes in the history of southeastern Montana and northern Wyoming.
An article I happened to write in the magazine, Montana, the Magazine of Western History. This was the cover. It's a great cover, isn't it? I thought that's one of the best ones of recent memory. So I guess we'll. So, okay. So hello, I'm glad to be here. I'm going to be telling you the short version of a very twisted but very totally true story. Ooh, now the lights come out too. The medium version can be found in my article. The winter 2022 version of edition to Montana, the Magazine of Western History. So let's begin. In November 4th, 1897, one of the blackest crimes to ever disgrace eastern Montana occurred. It occurred along this road. And you can't see. I'm sorry. What you can't see in the picture. Let's describe what you can't see in the picture. It occurred 8 miles north of Ashland, now in Rosebud County, but it was part of Custer County at the time. Okay. So this is where Ashland is. This is where Rosebud County is, and this is where Ashland is, and it's not 8 miles north of there. So we know where we're at. Okay. 21-year-old Clements Brown, was better known as Winnie, was driving a lumber wagon filled with vegetables home with his brothers. One brother was seated next to him in the wagon while another was following along on horseback. And while they were a few miles from their home, driving along the Lake Creek Road, as the road turned north, so the normal road's going west, and then you turn here, you go north. So you're looking north at this road. As they turned north, a rider appeared from behind them. This rider was hidden behind a great rock until he made his move. He approached them rapidly, masked, with a rifle in his hand. He was unnoticed until he rode past the Brown brother on the horseback. The masked rider shot Winnie through the right side of his abdomen, causing him to fall from the wagon. As when he fell, the rider continued to ride past him and rode to the top of a nearby hill. The rider exchanged some fire with the Brown brothers before jumping on his horse and escaping. Terribly wounded Winnie Brown was taken to the nearby home of his brother-in-law, where he laid in agony and passing away in the early hours of the next day. Before he died, he signed a statement identifying his assassin as Richard Dixon. Richard Dixon was a 22-year-old African-American laborer. He is well known in the area by a racist epithet that I'm not going to repeat here today. But he was well known in the area by that. After Winnie's death, the Custer County deputy found the tracks at the top of the hill along with some spent cartridges, and he followed these tracks to the local ranch of George and Regina Geddes. A horse matching that of the assassin's mount was found in the Geddes' barn, and within a few days, Richard Dixon was arrested in the company of his employer's wife, Regina Geddes. For her part, Regina Geddes maintained that Dixon had been ironing clothes with her all day on November 4th. And had this been a normal case, the arrest of Richard Dixon would have concluded this matter. This was far from a normal case, however. After a few days of resisting law enforcement, Dixon began talking, and he laid out a remarkable conspiracy to kill Winnie Brown that, when the news hit the papers, captivated the entire region. You see, according to Dixon, Dixon had killed Winnie Brown at the insistence of Regina Geddes on behalf of her husband. Quoting his testimony, here's what he said. Thursday, when I killed the boy, about 2 o'clock, Mrs. Geddes was ironing in the kitchen, and she went into the front room and took the field glasses and looked out and says, "Dick, there come the Brown boys." And she came back into the kitchen and wanted to know if I was not going to do that for George Geddes. And I told her no. And she says, go on and kill him. So he would not go on the witness stand and swear against George Geddes. And I went and I got the gun and I got on my horse and I went up the river inside the fence and the irrigating ditch, and I went to the mouth of Lake Creek and stayed there in a canyon and waited for the boys to come past. I shot and ran around a big butte. When I got to the ranch, I said, Mrs. Geddes, I done it. And she says, I'm not a damn bit sorry. He put us to a lot of trouble. And I said, I have done something I am sorry for, Mrs. Geddes. And she said, I am not. So that ends the quote. Dixon would later reveal that Regina Geddes burned the black handkerchief that Dixon used as a mask, admonished him for leaving shell cartridges behind, and hid the rifle used in the sealant. So what was the motive for this awful crime? What was the lot of trouble that Regina Geddes allegedly referred to? It was a criminal assault case and an associated civil lawsuit filed in June that year. Around that time, George Geddes began to hear rumors being spread by Winnie Brown that Regina's youngest child, born earlier that year, they had 3 children, and this had been the third one and been born just over that year. He heard that Winnie Brown was saying that this latest child had a parentage that did not include him. At least 2 men were speculated to be the father, family friend Tom Welch and Richard Dixon. So George Geddes did what anybody here would do in such a situation. He lured Winnie Brown to his ranch with an offer of work, put a gun to his head, stripped him to the waist, hung him from the rafters of his barn while he whipped him with a black snake whip tipped with wire for 15 straight minutes. Sometime later, Geddes let him go, and Winnie went to the authorities, and by June, Geddes was indicted for first-degree assault in a civil lawsuit. And this is that complaint, and that is Winnie Brown's signature. Richard Dixon's testimony that he had killed Winnie Brown to prevent him from testifying in this case. After a quick investigation, Custer County prosecutors ended up charging George Geddes, Regina Geddes, Tom Welch, and Richard Dixon for the murder of Winnie Brown, with Dixon being the star witness. As all the defendants were charged with the legal principle that members of the conspiracy are charged with the underlying crime. And George Geddes was the first one to stand trial in late 1897 in Miles City. While there was other evidence presented, mostly testimony from the Brown brothers about Dixon's actual killing, the bulk of the testimony came from Richard Dixon. Significantly, George Geddes was in Chicago at the time of the murders, having surgery on his arm. So he wasn't even there. He wasn't even in the time zone. The all-male, all-white jury convicted George Geddes of second-degree murder and sentenced him to a then unheard of 99 years. Next was the trial of Tom Welch, who was a part Native American cowpuncher who lived in the area and was well known. Welch used the same lawyers as George Geddes. And like George, he was also known to have been miles away from the scene when Winnie Brown was shot. He was working a roundup. Much of the same evidence from George Geddes' trial was used, and at the trial, most of it was, the evidence was the same as the George Geddes trial, with the exception of they detailed a failed attempt by Tom Welch earlier than the killing to lure Winnie Brown out into the prairie so he could kill him. Winnie was suspicious by these Tom Welch's actions and therefore didn't, and the attempt failed. The state also seriously implied, didn't actually say it, but they seriously implied that Tom Welch had a less than platonic relationship with both Geddeses. With him, he was welcomed at their house at all night hours of the night, always arriving alone, among other things. When he was arrested in Miles City, Tom Welch, that is, he had a picture of Regina Geddes on his person. The Miles City jury again here convicted Tom Welch of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Okay, so got that? Both of them second-degree murder. George Geddes, 99 years. Tom Welch, 20 years. Because of the tremendous amount of publicity generated in the first two trials and the shrinking jury pool of Miles City at this point, the trial of Regina Geddes was moved to Billings. Again, this trial featured the same defense counsel, the same prosecutors, the same judge. However, the publicity mentioned before was not limited to Miles City. This thing was plastered all over the state. Okay, when the crime happened, when the investigation happened, and when the trial came out, okay, this was front page news. And it was front page news statewide until April of 1898, when Regina Geddes' trial began. However, just at that time, the USS Maine was bombed in Havana. And that's the only thing that kept it off the front page. Nonetheless, the trial became a circus. The Billings Gazette became enthralled with the story of an attractive young white mother on trial for murder. Headlines such as, "She's a looker, she's a fine looker, fair female on trial" were used in their coverage. So fair female on trial, she's a fine looker. It didn't help the prosecution also commented on Regina's supposed beauty. This is a quote from the prosecutor in the opening statement. "The beauty of the fair defendant who was on trial for her life is to her what a royal robe would be to a demon queen." So, Billings Gazette needed a target to turn the fire away from this attractive white mother of three, and quickly found it in Richard Dixon. It blasted him with the admitted killer with racial slurs and attacks on his honesty. Here's just one example. Okay, Black Fiend's crime. In appearance, he is vicious and absolutely repulsive. The grinning Senegambian quickly became greatly enraged and at times fairly shouted and forth some of his answers. Okay, Richard Dixon was born in Iowa. He's not a Senegambian. The result was both surprising and not surprising. Regina Geddes' jury, again, all male, all white, hung with only one juror even willing to consider a murder charge of any kind. Despite testimony that she had ordered the crime, destroyed evidence, provided a false alimony, the jury refused to convict her. So what was the difference between Regina's trial and the previous two? The obvious answer, and there's a great deal supporting this at the time, was that the male jury refused to convict a rich, attractive white woman, despite all that evidence. Now, this is not a new thing, okay? The fact that criminality with women at the time was something that was differently considered, I would say, is not new. So what this case, though, does is it describes how gender impacted society's view of a crime. In many cases, women were simply not considered capable of committing crimes. And what makes this trial important is it demonstrates the scale of it. In comparing the three trials, you can control for things that would normally complicate comparing different trials and different outcomes. Here we have the same crime, the same lawyers, the same judge, pretty much the same evidence. The two towns in which it occurred, Billings and Miles City, were both moderately sized frontier towns with similar demographics. Yet the scale of the gender differences can be clearly demonstrated with these cases. In George Geddes' trial, the jury's first vote was a unanimous guilt for second-degree murder. The Tom Welch jury, the initial vote was 10-2 guilty. Regina Geddes, on the other hand, was 11-1 not guilty. And after the trial, the 11 got to the press and roasted to a finish with the one guy that didn't. So Regina Geddes' hung jury resulted in a mistrial, and the prosecutor tried and failed to change the venue for another trial. The three Geddes trials and a fourth that occurred at the same time had severely strained Custer County's finances, so in June 1898, Regina Geddes was released. In 1899, the convictions of George Geddes and Tom Welch were reversed by the Montana State Supreme Court, who ordered new trials for them as well. They were reversed because the prosecution had to too much of an extent in the view of the Supreme Court relied on the testimony of Richard Dixon. They needed to have more direct evidence of the conspiracy, and they also had some issues with the prosecutors, particularly in Tom Welch's case. So they ordered new trials for these two guys. And again, the Custer County said, we can't afford this anymore, and let them go. So let's summarize. The only one who took any responsibility for their actions, the poorly educated black man, ended up being the only one to serve serious time. Okay. Now looking at this case, don't the actions of the Geddes seem a bit extreme? If Winnie Brown was lying about Regina's fidelity, does this account for George's torture? Tom Welch's efforts to lure Winnie Brown? Richard Dixon gunning him down? In my view, it does not. If Winnie Brown's accusations were false, George Geddes had a number of options to seek justice, yet he clearly did not. And I speculate that the reason for a 6-month-long conspiracy involving 4 people, the reason this much effort was put into this was because at least some of Winnie Brown's rumor mongering was true. And more importantly, it threatened George Geddes's fragile finances. And this wasn't explored too much in the trial because all they had was Richard Dixon's testimony, and that was as far as that testimony could take them. And it was enough to convict George Geddes and Tom Welch. It wasn't enough to convict Regina, but it was enough to convict them. You see, George Geddes was what was called a remittance man, a son of either Eastern American or European aristocrats who came west to play cowboy, but were financially dependent on money from home. In this case, George Geddes was the son of Peter Geddes, a millionaire who lived in New York and who served on the board of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Peter Geddes was also the American representative of George Chicago Smith, who is a Scottish financier and one of the richest men in the world. And he was also George Geddes' godfather and namesake. The prosecution told the press after the trials that they believed Winnie Brown's lawsuit threatened an anticipated inheritance from either Peter Geddes or George Smith. So this is Regina Geddes. She was raised in Helena, right here. Actually, spent most of her adult life in Unionville. And this was the portrait found at Tom Welch's arrest. Winnie Brown was buried in this little cemetery off the three people live in this cemetery. His mother, Winnie, and his brother, the one that was sitting next to him when he was shot. Okay, and there's no actual headstone there. That's just it. And you can barely, and that's as far as it is from the road. You can barely see it. So that's what the Geddes is about. And then of course it all goes to heck after this. And like I said, this is the short version. Every avenue about this has some sick twist on it. And if you want to do that, you can read the article. And I've got some extra copies of it if you want to. And if we have time, I got a good story about this picture. But it turns out in 1899, George Smith dies. George Geddes gets his money. In 1899, George Smith dies and he's released by the Montana Supreme Court. Should be Regina's best day ever. Okay, or best year ever. Well, actually, George Geddes then comes over and has her sign away the ranch and then abandons her and leaves for Australia. He gets mad. And then there's a sidebar article. She ends up running a brothel in Forsyth. And anyway, and it's really, Regina Geddes is really, on the one hand, she's the demon queen. She's the one who did all of this. But on the other hand, her ability to adapt and survive, in this case, in some cases, is really quite remarkable. Tom Welch, after he was free, went to work in Anaconda at the Anaconda smelter and died in 1901. And that's when he died, that's when the Anaconda Standard recalled the trial and said, we call it the blackest crime ever disgraced eastern Montana. So there's this story, like I said, starting to become forgotten. There's no memorial out there for anybody, and it was just a whispered trial. Richard Dixon, by the way, went to prison for about 20 years, was paroled, and then was released. And I haven't even been. I think he's buried in Iowa. So what happened to Regina Geddes? Well, like I said, sometime right after the trials, she gave up the rights to her 3 children. And by the way, just so there's nothing to prove this, but the third child, her race is listed as white, whatever that means. Okay. But she gave up parental rights to her 3 children. Like I said, for probably about 10 years, she operated a brothel in Forsyth. And she had a little incident with the local law enforcement that's kind of funny. So the title of the sidebar is called "Whose 20 Is This?" It's about the local law enforcement tried to shake her down, and she didn't take it well, and they lost. But anyway, then she and her kid, she gave up control of her kids, but she stayed with them. So wherever she is, they are. As I look through the census records and everything else, and she eventually ends up over in the Portland, Oregon area. She married a third time. George Geddes was her second husband. Her first husband abandoned her when she was probably in her teens. And so she married for a third time, and that marriage lasted for a little bit, for quite a while actually, and he died, and then she died in, I believe 57 or 53, apparently a penitent Catholic. So, I don't know. And I like to, this story has been, and so what happened in the meantime is the story of her being in a brothel and this Winnie Brown murder got joined in the local rumors. And so then it was Winnie Brown was talking about her career as a prostitute, and that's what she got mad at. Okay, and so that's interesting. Anyway, and I'll end this. Does anybody know who Wally McCrae is? He's a poet. He's a cowboy poet. He lives right where this occurred. Okay, and he wrote a poem about it. Do you like cowboy poetry? Now I'm going to edit this because there's some language here that I'm not comfortable saying. So I'll edit it. But if you feel the meter being a little off, that's why. Okay, so I'll try to do this the best way I can. Called Regina Geddes, The Shooting of Winnie Brown. Okay? Damn you, Regina Geddes. Damn your soul to hell. And damn your gutless husband and Richard Dixon as well. Winnie Brown weren't no angel, or so the people say, but he deserved a better fate than being shot that day. Backshot right off his wagon when he was headed home. Bushwhacked he was by Richard Dixon, no more to ride, no or roam. She's the one that done it though. She didn't hold the gun after she had floozied him and she'd had her fun. She told her gutless husband, him the remittance man, got Richard Dixon to shoot him. Oh, it was all her plan. They sent Richard Dixon to the plan, and when he went to heaven, they didn't send her any place, Regina in 97. She and her limp husband just kind of snuck away. But folks along the Greenleaf cuss her to this day. Damn you, Regina Geddes, damn your soul to hell, and damn your gutless husband and Richard Dixon as well.